Let's start with the scene. Air Force One touches down at Beijing Capital Airport on May 13, 2026. Chinese youth line the tarmac, waving synchronized American and Chinese flags. Brass bands play, soldiers stand in perfect formation. A red carpet welcome ceremony unfolds at the Great Hall of the People. Then comes a tour of the Temple of Heaven, followed by a state banquet featuring Beijing roast duck, pan-fried pork buns, and kung pao chicken at the Zhongnanhai compound, the inner sanctum where China's top leadership lives and governs, a place so exclusive that even foreign heads of state rarely set foot inside it. And President Donald Trump, by all accounts, loved every single second of it. When Trump sat beside Xi against a backdrop of ornate tapestries, he said, "I think a lot of good has come from this visit. We've made some fantastic trade deals, good for both countries." That phrase, fantastic trade deals, is the headline. That's what went out across every wire service, every news network, every social media platform. Fantastic deals, fantastic future, incredible visit. But when you pull back the curtain, strip away the pageantry and the superlatives, and apply the kind of rigorous, sourced analysis that this subject demands, a far more complicated picture comes into view. Because what happened in Beijing this week wasn't simply a trade summit. It was a geopolitical stress test, and the results are deeply revealing about where American power stands, where it's been quietly traded away, and what the costs may be for ordinary Americans not just today, but for years and decades to come. Let's go through it systematically. First, what was actually agreed to and what wasn't. When the wheels of Air Force One lifted up from Beijing on Friday, Trump was wrapping a 3-day visit with many questions still outstanding about what exactly he and Xi had agreed to. Over the weekend, statements from both sides started to demystify the outcomes of a meeting that was largely about resetting the tone between the world's top two economies after a fractious year that drove both to the edge of decoupling. So from the White House's perspective, there were 3 headline achievements. China will buy at least $17 billion of American agricultural goods annually through 2028, the White House said, noting it would be in addition to soybean purchase commitments made in October 2025. Second, China would make an initial purchase of 200 American-made Boeing aircraft. And third, the U.S. and China are poised to set up 2 new institutions, a Board of Trade and a Board of Investment, to manage economic ties. Statements from the White House and China's Ministry of Commerce confirmed. Those are the top lines. Soybeans, planes, new trade boards. That's the deal Trump flew halfway around the world to announce. Now let's examine each one honestly. On the agricultural front, the $17 billion figure sounds significant. But context matters enormously here. That level of purchases would be a major jump from last year, when American agricultural exports to China totaled only $8.4 billion, according to U.S. government data. But it's not far off from levels in 2024, the last year of the Biden administration and before Trump's tariff war. In other words, we are not looking at a windfall. We are looking at a partial recovery from a crisis that the Trump administration itself created by imposing sky-high tariffs on Chinese goods in 2025, which triggered Chinese retaliation and the near total collapse of American agricultural sales to the world's largest market. The $17 billion commitment is a step toward restoring what existed before the trade war, not a historic new gain. And importantly, China's Commerce Ministry did not specify an amount or name soybeans in its official readout of the summit. That matters. The 2 sides are not even agreeing in writing on the same set of numbers. Washington claims $17 billion. Beijing says they will promote expanded trade in agricultural products. Those are not the same statement. On the Boeing deal, the 200 aircraft purchase was the headline Wall Street was watching most closely. While it's China's first purchase of American-made commercial jets since 2017, it's less than half of the 500 jets markets were expecting China to order, sending Boeing shares sliding nearly 4% on Thursday. Markets were expecting 500 planes. They got 200. Shares dropped. That is not a win for American manufacturing workers. That is a disappointment dressed up in diplomatic language. And even that 200 plane figure came with uncertainty. Trump himself, when pressed by reporters, said, I think it was a commitment. I mean, it was sort of like a statement, but I think it was a commitment. The President of the United States, describing what he characterized as a major trade deal, admitted he wasn't entirely sure whether it was a deal at all. This isn't the first time this story has been written. During Trump's first visit to China in 2017, the U.S. Commerce Department announced 37 deals totaling more than $250 billion before the American leader had even left Beijing, including a commitment from China to buy 300 Boeing airplanes, a commitment that was never fulfilled. History does not just rhyme here, it is almost verbatim repetition. Now let's talk about what the experts actually said. Not the politicians, not the spin doctors, but the people who study U.S.-China relations for a living. Wendy Cutler, a former negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, told CBS News, "I was expecting that China would announce mega purchases of U.S. agriculture, energy, and airplanes. So far, it doesn't seem like Trump and his team have a lot to show for the visit." David Meal, head of the China practice at Eurasia Group, said, "It looks like both sides are saying they got somewhere, but we are not there yet. We are still waiting." Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations said the summit reduced near-term escalation risk, but it doesn't really remove the structural risks that matter most to companies and investors, like tariffs, export controls, technology restrictions, and rare earths. The issue of Taiwan, energy security, these are still there. Their conclusion: the U.S.-China relationship is being stabilized, at least temporarily. It's not being repaired. That is a remarkable statement. Not repaired, stabilized temporarily. And what does that cost Americans in practical terms? It means the uncertainty continues. It means American companies still cannot plan long-term supply chains with confidence. It means the investment drought in key sectors, semiconductors, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, continues. And it means the underlying competitive dynamics between the two largest economies on Earth remain unresolved, with the next flashpoint always just one tariff announcement, one military exercise, one diplomatic slight away from reigniting. Now we get to the part of this story that the celebratory headlines buried, and this is the part that should genuinely concern every American regardless of their politics, what was quietly given away in Beijing. Let's start with Taiwan. Trump on Monday, before even boarding Air Force One for Beijing, told reporters in the Oval Office that U.S. arms sales to Taiwan would be on the agenda. "President Xi would like us not to," he said, "and I'll have that discussion." That single sentence, "and I'll have that discussion," sent tremors through Taipei, through Tokyo, through Seoul, through every American ally in the Indo-Pacific that depends on the credibility of U.S. security commitments. Because for decades, the United States has maintained a clear bipartisan principle: we do not consult Beijing on arms sales to Taiwan. That policy traces back to Ronald Reagan. A formal document from 1982 explicitly established that the U.S. would not seek China's input on the matter. Trump dismissed that entirely, saying, "What am I going to do? Say I don't want to talk about it? Because we have an agreement signed in 1982? No, we discussed arms sales." The strategic implications of that statement are profound. According to the Brookings Institution, this is not just a policy shift. It is a shift from deterrence to deal-making in a domain where there is no deal to be made, beyond offering unilateral concessions that undermine deterrence. Brookings went further, noting that if Trump acts on his thinking about treating Taiwan arms sales as leverage, he would crater the confidence of America's security commitments, not just in Taiwan, but among America's allies more broadly. Brookings also pointed out the strategic trap here. Chinese officials have long argued that American arms sales to Taiwan are not up for negotiation. They assert that the U.S. already reached an understanding in 1982 that it would reduce and eventually end arms sales to Taiwan. So from Beijing's perspective, it will not negotiate to buy the same horse twice. In other words, Trump appears to be dangling a concession that Beijing believes it already has secured. Trump is giving up credibility without extracting benefits from Beijing. And Trump went further than just discussing arms sales. He echoed Xi's talking points about how Taiwan had been part of China for thousands of years. He said he was not looking to have somebody go independent. He told reporters he questioned whether it made sense for American forces to travel 9,500 miles to fight a war. The net effect of his comments, as described in the post-summit Brookings analysis, was to suggest that his views on Taiwan independence were closer to Beijing's preferences, that Taiwan had a greater responsibility to avoid provoking conflict, and that America's security support for Taiwan was negotiable with China. The analysis noted that Trump's comments placed him apart from the views of most American experts and officials, including those within his own administration, who judged that China's steadily increasing pressure on Taiwan has been the principal source of rising tensions. Why does this matter to ordinary Americans? Because Taiwan is not just a geopolitical abstraction. Taiwan produces the most advanced semiconductors in the world, the chips that power American iPhones, American AI systems, American defense technology, American hospitals, American financial systems. Any destabilization of Taiwan's security, any erosion of the deterrence that keeps Beijing from taking aggressive action, has direct material consequences for the American economy and for American national security. If the message sent from Beijing this week is that Washington's commitment to Taiwan is negotiable, the cost of that message will be paid not by diplomats in think tanks, but by American workers, American consumers, and American soldiers. Then there is the question of rare earths, and this may be the most underreported dimension of the entire summit. According to the International Energy Agency, China was responsible for 59% of the world's rare earths mining and 91% of its refining in 2024. 91%. That is not a market imbalance. That is a chokehold. And Beijing used that chokehold precisely as a weapon during the 2025 trade war. China leveraged its dominance over rare earths when it responded to Trump's tariff escalation. The pressure it exerted by restricting rare earth exports was a key catalyst for the two superpowers agreeing to a trade truce. In plain language, America blinked, because without Chinese rare earths, American defense manufacturing stalls. Electric vehicles don't get built. Advanced weapon systems can't be produced. The entire high-tech industrial base of the United States has a single critical dependency, and that dependency lives in China. The White House said after the summit that China would address U.S. concerns on supply chain shortages of rare earths and other critical minerals. But Beijing's official statements did not explicitly mention rare earths at all. Beijing said what it needed to say to let the summit end gracefully while committing to nothing concrete. Analysts noted that even with any potential deal, China's control over rare earths will likely remain a source of potential leverage that Beijing has now demonstrated it is fully willing to use. America goes home having addressed concerns. China goes home with its structural advantage entirely intact. Let's now look at the tech dimension, because technology was supposed to be a centerpiece of this summit. Trump brought Jensen Huang of NVIDIA. He brought Tim Cook of Apple. He brought Elon Musk of Tesla. 17 executives in total. The executives who traveled to Beijing seeking inroads to the Chinese market are facing a much tougher sell now because of China's success in nurturing and developing homegrown firms as part of a national push to boost self-sufficiency in tech, manufacturing, and domestic consumption. A push that was given a significant boost by the trade war launched by the first Trump administration. In other words, the tariffs of 2025 didn't just hurt American farmers and consumers. They accelerated Chinese technological self-sufficiency. Beijing used the pain of the trade war as a forcing function to build domestic alternatives to everything it had previously purchased from American companies. Now those American executives flew to Beijing to try to regain market access in a country that spent the last year specifically reducing its dependency on them. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, a last-minute addition to the trip, has lobbied the U.S. government to approve sales of its less advanced chips to China. However, China has held off on purchases in part because of its preference to support its own chip makers. Tesla, whose CEO Elon Musk traveled to Beijing as well, has been losing ground inside China and across much of the globe to Chinese EV rival BYD. According to Counterpoint Research, Tesla's EV market share in China fell to 10% in the last quarter of 2025, compared to 14% a year earlier. This is the broader story of American economic leverage in China. It is shrinking. Not because of bad diplomacy in isolation, but because of a structural shift in the global technology landscape that years of trade war have accelerated. The Beijing summit did not reverse that trend. It paused it briefly with handshakes and a commitment to 2 new boards. Now let's address one of the most analytically significant assessments of this summit, the one that came from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Chatham House Research Institute. Because these institutions look not just at what happened, but at what it means for the long arc of U.S.-China competition. The CFR analysis found that from China's perspective, Xi Jinping linked all economic and diplomatic progress explicitly to the Taiwan question, making clear that any stability or progress in the relationship in areas that President Trump cares about, from economics to fentanyl or rare earths, will be linked to how he handles the Taiwan question. The analysis added, Xi Jinping is messaging to an audience in Taipei, and he wants to create doubts in Taiwan about the extent to which it can rely on the United States. Read that again slowly. China is using the prospect of economic benefits, soybeans, planes, rare earths, investment boards, as leverage to reshape America's strategic posture on Taiwan. Every trade concession Beijing dangles is simultaneously a signal to Taipei that Washington's commitment is conditional. And that signal, broadcast loudly from a state banquet in Beijing, echoes across the entire Indo-Pacific Alliance network. Chatham House offered a sober assessment of the strategic frame. While Xi pursues relationship management as strategy, Trump takes a more transactional and improvisational approach. The Institute warned that against a U.S. system that operates in news cycles and swings between elections, even modest long-term discipline is advantageous to Beijing. This is the core asymmetry at work. Xi Jinping thinks in terms of decades. He has a long-game strategy for repositioning China in the global order. Trump thinks in terms of transactions, this deal, this trip, this headline. And when a long-game strategist sits across from a transactional dealmaker, the transactional dealmaker tends to get the worst of it over time, even when the individual moments look like wins. There's something else worth examining, what the markets said on Friday when Air Force One left Beijing. Because markets are, whatever their flaws, perhaps the most honest real-time assessors of actual versus announced value. Investors, decrying the lack of specifics, sold off stocks. Dow futures were down more than 300 points. The broader S&P 500 futures fell 1%, and NASDAQ futures were 1.4% lower. Soybean futures sold off sharply after the U.S. spoke of a nebulous commitment from China to buy agricultural products. Bond yields rose as traders grew cautious about rising inflation. This is a market saying, as clearly as markets can say anything, we don't believe these deals are real yet. We don't see the substance. We're pricing uncertainty, not victory. And that uncertainty has real costs. When supply chains remain unstable, American companies pay more. When tariff structures remain unclear, American manufacturers can't plan. When the rare earth question remains unresolved, American defense contractors face input shortages. Every week of unresolved strategic uncertainty between the world's 2 largest economies costs the American economy. And those costs aggregate silently, invisibly, in factory closure notices and higher consumer prices and supply chain rerouting decisions made in boardrooms that never make the evening news. Let's talk about what this summit will cost Americans in terms they can feel directly. The agricultural commitment sounds like a win for American farmers. And in the short term, if it holds, it may partially help farmers in Iowa, Kansas, and the Mississippi Delta who watch their Chinese market evaporate in 2025. But these purchase commitments are structured to last only through 2028. They are not permanent market restoration. They are conditional, time-limited, and Beijing has already shown in 2017 that similar commitments can simply fail to materialize. One analyst who works with the China desk at a political risk firm put it bluntly, Beijing will say what they need to say to make things nice for the next couple of years, while preparing for the next U.S. president who will likely take a harsher stance. That is what this summit is in many ways, a carefully managed pause, both sides stepping back from the edge, not because the underlying competition has been resolved, but because both economies were taking damage from the confrontation and needed breathing room. Beijing buys soybeans and Boeing planes. Washington gets headlines, and the deep structural conflict over technology, over Taiwan, over military dominance in the Pacific, over the architecture of the global economy that continues unchanged, just temporarily less loud. On energy, Trump claimed Chinese tankers would soon be on their way to buy American crude oil, sending oil prices climbing. But China had not confirmed those details. On the rare earths crisis, the White House claimed progress, but Beijing's statements contained no such confirmation. On semiconductor export controls, the single most consequential technology policy issue of the decade, the summit produced nothing concrete. The gap between Washington's claims and Beijing's confirmations is not a minor discrepancy. It is a pattern, and that pattern tells you who is driving this relationship. Now, let's be honest about something that often gets lost in partisan analysis. This summit was not a catastrophic failure. It was not the Munich Agreement. The world did not end. The two largest economies on Earth chose dialogue over escalation, and that is genuinely better than the alternative. Short-term conflict risk has been reduced. Both sides agreed to mechanisms, the trade board, the investment board, that, if they function, could provide channels for managing future disputes. Xi and Trump plan to meet again in Washington in September, which maintains the diplomatic line. But there is a difference between avoiding catastrophe and achieving strategy. Trump avoided catastrophe in Beijing. He did not achieve strategy, and the people who will pay the price for that gap are not the executives who flew business class to the state banquet at Zhongnanhai. They are the semiconductor engineers in Arizona wondering whether their export licenses will survive the next geopolitical shift. They are the farmers in the Midwest who have watched their soybean markets collapse and return and collapse again, hostage to a bilateral relationship they cannot control. They are the defense workers in Virginia and Alabama and Texas who depend on supply chains that run through materials Beijing controls. And they are the taxpayers who fund the military posture in the Pacific that just had its deterrent logic partially undermined by a president who wondered aloud whether it made sense to travel 9,500 miles to defend Taiwan. Here is perhaps the most important long-term cost of this trip that nobody is discussing loudly enough: credibility. American foreign policy credibility. The belief among allies and adversaries alike that Washington will do what it says is not an abstraction. It is a strategic asset with measurable value. When allies in Tokyo and Seoul and Canberra watch an American president consult Beijing on arms sales to Taiwan, breaking with a policy that has held for 44 years, they update their threat calculations. They wonder whether Washington will consult Beijing the next time China rattles its sabers in the South China Sea. They wonder whether the security guarantees in their own alliance treaties are as firm as they appear. And in that wondering, they begin quietly hedging, reaching out to other partners, accelerating their own defense spending, building the kind of strategic redundancy that nations build when they no longer trust that their patron is fully reliable. The Brookings Institution warned explicitly, if Trump acts on his approach to Taiwan arms sales as leverage, he would crater the confidence of America's security commitments, not just in Taiwan, but among America's allies more broadly. That credibility, once lost, does not return with a press conference. It does not return with a signed deal or a photograph at a state banquet. It returns slowly, over years, through consistent behavior, and the cost of rebuilding it, if it becomes necessary, will be far higher than anything that was traded away for soybeans and 200 Boeing jets. So where does this leave us? Scott Kennedy of the Center for Strategic and International Studies offered a blunt assessment. China comes into this meeting far more confident than in 2017, when it feared even a small rise in U.S. tariffs. In the last year, Xi has been able to push back and neutralize much of Trump's actions. Chatham House put it succinctly, the U.S. list of concrete deliverables is short. Keep rare earths flowing, create a board of trade mechanism for non-sensitive sectors, and secure Chinese purchase commitments. The gap between this short agenda and the long list of issues between two nations engaged in grinding, multidimensional competition reveals a shared preference for managing their rivalry rather than resolving it. Managing, not resolving. Stabilizing, not repairing. That is the honest summary of Beijing, May 2026. The fantastic future Trump spoke of in Beijing may be real. There is a version of the world where these deals hold, where the boards of trade and investment produce genuine liberalization, where Chinese agricultural purchases flow reliably to American farmers, where Boeing planes get built and delivered, and where the two nations find a durable framework for coexistence that serves both peoples. That version of the future is possible, but so is another version, one where the Boeing commitment follows the same path as the 300-plane deal from 2017, announced with fanfare, quietly abandoned. One where the $17 billion agricultural commitment proves to be as conditional and fragile as every previous commitment Beijing has made and withdrawn. One where the ambiguity on Taiwan, instead of serving as strategic flexibility, reads in Beijing as a green light to escalate pressure. One where the structural advantage China holds in rare earths and critical minerals, never truly addressed in Beijing, becomes a crisis at the worst possible moment, in a future conflict or economic emergency when supply chains need to function. Americans deserve to know that both versions exist. They deserve to know that the pageantry in Beijing, however impressive, is not the same as leverage. That a state banquet at Zhongnanhai, however symbolically significant, is not the same as a binding agreement. And that when a president returns from a foreign capital announcing fantastic deals, the right question to ask is not what was announced, but what was confirmed, what was conceded, what was left unresolved, and who will be paying for those answers years from now.